there is a lot of talk about crime in the United States, a lot of talk about high robbery rates in the Bay Area, in Oakland, in Chicago, in San Francisco, talk of high murder rates in Chicago and Detroit. And you have these maniacs giving their opinions as to how to stop this rising crime rate, how to lower down crime. And they will blame the police. They will say, well, what's really needed is more education. What's really needed is more funds. We got to throw some more money at the problem. What's really needed is we need more investment, more funds being given to these schools in the inner cities. That's what's really needed. And then you have the armies of activists just rooting on for the zombies, praising the zombies, and just expressing nothing but support for these insane ideas. Yeah, what's really needed is some more funds. Give it all to the poor. Give the money to the poor. Damn the rich. Police are all bastards. Police, yeah, they're all pigs, and they're the problem. Over-policing is the problem. We have over-policing in this community. I've been living in this community my whole life. I've been raised in this community here in the inner cities of New York, and I must say that the problem is over-policing. We have an insane, out-of-control police force, and that's the problem, and the community is just suffering for it. The problem is not the criminals. The problem is not the thugs. The problem is a lack of education and a lack of funds. That's the problem. That's the problem right now, everybody.
But let's deal with the issue of how do you address crime? You do not address crime with policing. You have to address crime in a holistic way. And unfortunately, Philip, Republicans and conservatives do not want to do that in this country. It's a matter of more jails, more police, more funding. Let's increase the funding, but not deal with the fundamental underpinning of crime in neighborhoods, which is poverty.
This is the insanity that has taken over America. This is the cancer that has been just spreading all throughout American society. But, in the midst of all this insanity, we can look southwards towards a country that rarely anyone ever talks about. It's a country in Central America. It's called El Salvador. And currently, El Salvador is a light in the midst of all of this insanity. Because when you live in America, you are living in almost a crazy house. A lot of America is a crazy house. You go to the store, you'll see people on drugs, and you go to a restaurant. I'm not joking, guys. Last week, I went to a restaurant, and I saw a woman talking to herself. And I'm thinking to myself, I hope she's like, talking to somebody on the Bluetooth, because if she's not, she's insane, and she could shoot up the place. So, I'm trying to be optimistic. So I'm like, she's probably just talking on a Bluetooth, one of those little headpieces where you can talk to people without, carrying a phone. And the woman gets up, and like a scene from a horror movie, she just drops on her knees and bows down. And I'm like, it's not a Bluetooth, it's the devil, it's demons, everybody. She's worshiping demons. She's worshiping some demon that she sees and no one else sees in the room. And because she's demonically influenced, she's seeing a demon, and she's prostrating before the demon that is demanding worship from her. El Salvador was overran by Satanists. Literally overran by Satanists. It was overran by these horrific gangs, MS-13 or Malva Salvatrucha or something like that. MS-13, and then you had another gang called the Revolucionarios. You have the Centrales Locos, the Central Crazy People. I'm guessing that's what that means. And they were, I think, a clique of MS-13. And now all of these gangs have been either driven out or imprisoned. A lot of these gangsters have been imprisoned. They are currently in prison. And the government of El Salvador has done a very efficient job in purging the streets of these monsters. You cannot imagine how horrific it was to live under these monsters. To live under these monsters. These people were absolute monsters. And they were the reason why El Salvador had at one point the highest murder rate on earth. And for years, we have been hearing about the atrociously high murder rate in El Salvador. And I heard that it was the highest. It had the highest murder rate in the world, and I've also heard that it had one of the highest murder rates in the world, and the murder rate has dropped significantly. Why? It wasn't because the government put more funds into the community. It wasn't because the government just threw money at the problem. It wasn't because the government defunded the police, because the problem in the society is over-policing. Police are getting out of control. It was because the government over-policed the society and is over-policing the society because the policy is still being implemented. The government has enacted a policy of strong policing, doing mass arrests. And when gangsters try to fight back, cops will shoot them. And that's the solution. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that the solution to high crime rates is heavy policing and killing criminals? Who would have thought? But in America, you can't say that without people mocking you, scoffing at you, and calling you an authoritarian or a fascist or a crazy conservative or a racist. And when you watch some of these commentators, or when you read some of these political commentators in the United States, like people from the New York Times or people from The Guardian, you will read and you will hear all of the lunacy of the Western world, which is, the solution is not arresting, doing mass arrests. The solution is not actually killing criminals, killing bad guys. The solution is we need more education. That's the reason why. Oh, yes. Yeah. I remember growing up in the Bay Area. You know, I went to a public education when I was growing up in Northern California. And the school would try different ways to make the campus look charming and nice, and it always got trashed. I remember in my middle school, the school did a little garden, for the school. And they put up these little cincillas, these little, terraces made of rocks, and then they would fill it up with soil. And we worked on it, actually. Me and my class, we actually worked on this, and we cultivated the soil. And then eventually, the school put in flowers and various different plants to try to make it look nice. And within like a week or so, the whole thing was trashed. Plants were pulled out, the rock formations were just torn up and just disassembled. Rocks were scattered. It just looked ugly. I mean, they made it look ugly because people who hate beauty, I don't care how old they are, people who hate beauty will always hate beauty. Unless they have some sort of an epiphany. But people who are dysfunctional, people who are feral, people who are zombies, people who are just evil and abominable, they're just going to continue on their ways, unless, of course, by some miracle they have a change of heart. But that doesn't really happen too often, unfortunately. I remember in my high school in California, a bunch of kids, literally a gang of kids, decided to go into the bathroom and to take dumps into some buckets and splatter the shit all over the walls because they thought it was funny. And who had to fix up the mess? It was the poor janitor who had to fix up the mess. And of course, those kids didn't get seriously punished. If it was up to me, they would be getting a beating. Right, they would have gotten a good beating from some police officers. But if you do that in America, it's police brutality. It's excessive force. It's just a police force that's just gone out of hand. This is disgusting. I mean, this is terrible, terrible. That's America. And we have the Western media attacking El Salvador for doing exactly what needs to be done to get rid of a high crime rate. And one thing that the government did, by the way, I want to say the president of El Salvador, who has lowered the crime rate immensely in his country, his name is Nayib Bukele. Now let me tell you guys something. Nayib Bukele, that's not a Spanish name, guys. That's not a typical Latin American name, all right? His name isn't Armando Vosotros or something like that. His name is Nayib Bukele. So when I saw his name, I'm like, okay, this guy's Middle Eastern. And sure enough, his paternal grandparents came from the West Bank, specifically from Bethlehem, which is where my Palestinian side of my heritage comes from. My father was born in Bethlehem. So, in other words, it took a Palestinian guy to fix up the mess. It took a Middle Eastern guy to fix up the problem. And for decades, El Salvador has had a problem with huge crime rates and lots of horrific violence, but it took a Middle Eastern guy to come in and say, hey, what needs to be done is some serious purging. What needs to be done is a purge. And it really goes to show the differences in mindset here, the differences between the Western mindset and the Middle Eastern mindset, or the Eastern mindset, because Russians and Eastern European people, they also have an overlap in mindsets and mentalities with Middle Eastern people. Central America is still part of the West. We may not consider it so, but it is. It's part of the Western world. And it also has been infected with this insane way of thinking of, what needs to be done is some more help for the people, the poor. The poor need help. And Mexico is riddled with this cancer. South America has been taken over by this cancer, this cancerous way of thinking, which is sympathy for literally the scum of humanity, sympathy for the criminal, even when it comes to just the criminal doing the most horrific things imaginable to innocent people. You have these activists in South America who will hate the church and who will promote anarchy. And there's a lot of this in the Spanish-speaking world, a lot of anarchism. I remember a number of years ago hearing about dozens of church burnings in Chile done by these crazy anti-Christian anarchist terrorists. So this type of cancer has taken over Latin America. And you see this sort of thing. And some Middle Eastern guy comes along and says, no, what needs to be done is heavy policing. It's amazing how much the Western world will attack this way of governing. Bashar al-Assad, Gaddafi, these were, or Bashar al-Assad is still in power in Syria, but these guys are they are political leaders of the Middle Eastern mentality. The way Middle Eastern political leaders tend to work is they get rid of the competition. They kill off the competition, and they give free stuff to people. This is how they usually work. They will kill off the terrorists and all of the criminal elements, put them in prison, get rid of them because they are a threat. No matter how small of a threat they may be, they are still a threat. And so the government will get rid of them, and the government will make sure that the society is happy by giving people free services, free public transportation, free education, free medical care, and the government will make sure that food prices are very low. And this brings a very, very good balance. Criminal elements are pretty much gone, crime rates are extremely low, and the people are happy with cheap food prices and free medical care. And this brings harmony in society. You can't really have harmony in society if you are afraid of just going to the grocery store because somebody might shoot up the place or somebody might rob the store. you can't have harmony in a society if you are afraid of going to church, because somebody could go to the church and open fire on the congregation. And this has happened numerous times in the United States. You can't have harmony in a society like that. So you have to be tough on crime. You have to have over policing. You have to be you have to impose a heavy hand on those who deserve a heavy hand. And that's the way you get rid of a high crime rate. You do not get rid of crime by being lenient on those who are committing the crimes. You get rid of crime by getting rid of the people who cause the crime. You get rid of the criminals. You put them in prison, and if they are extremely egregious, you put them under capital punishment. It really is that simple. Who would have thought that the solution to a high crime rate is simply getting rid of the criminals? But you have these lunatics in America who want to put this emphasis on, a lack of education or more public funds. That's what's needed. No, what's needed is high policing, heavy policing. It really is that simple. And that is what Nayib Bukele has done in El Salvador, because he's Middle Eastern and he has a Middle Eastern mentality. That mentality can be seen in people like Bashar al-Assad, people like Gaddafi, people like Mubarak, who was extremely tough on terrorism, extremely tough on terrorist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood when he was ruling over Egypt. And the Western world demonized Mubarak by saying, oh, he was this evil tyrant and he was terrible. Well, the United States government overthrew Mubarak through a proxy. The proxy was a revolutionary mob. And after Mubarak was overthrown, the Muslim Brotherhood took over Egypt. And then you had a military coup, and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took over, and now he's an ally of Russia. Now you have basically a Russian proxy ruling over Egypt, which is way better than the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, yeah, absolutely. But we meaning the Western world, demonized Mubarak and called him a tyrant. But the reality is that he was doing exactly what he needed to do as a leader. Because if you do not get rid of these criminal elements, terrorist elements, they will murder people and they will kill you. They will overthrow you and kill you. And if you do not get rid of the criminal elements and you allow them to thrive and you make the environment in a way that they are enabled to thrive and to grow and to become more powerful, they will take over your society. And who will suffer? All of the regular folks who have nothing to do with it. That's exactly what happened in El Salvador. You had these lunatics in MS-13 and other gangs, 18th Street, all these gangs taking over the country. And they took over the country. These MS-13 guys, believe it or not, they started out as metalheads in California. They started out as people who were listening to Ozzy Osbourne and a bunch of other metal bands. And they were in California. These were people who migrated to the United States, running away from the horrific civil war that was in El Salvador, that was going on in El Salvador. And so you had a bunch of young El Salvadorans who were living in California. They were being bullied, ostracized because they were from El Salvador. And so they began to just stay together. They stuck together, and they would go to metal concerts, Ozzy Osbourne concerts, and they became obsessed with the devil. They became obsessed with Satanism, and they became Satanists. And they would use this sign representing the horns of the devil. And to this day, the symbol of MS-13 are the horns of the devil. That's the symbol of MS-13. And they love to do this little gesture with their fingers, and they'll put the devil's horns as a tattoo on their bodies. I mean, these people are Satanists. They are zombies. And you look at them, they're covered in tattoos. They look possessed. They are possessed with the very demons that possess the souls of the Aztecs, who were ruling over Mexico and killing tens of thousands of people as human sacrifices to their diabolical gods. Those very demons that possess that ancient civilization are now possessing these gangsters. And they ruled over El Salvador horrifically Horrifically. And it wasn't just like, it wasn't as though they were just killing other criminals. No, they were murdering innocent people for fun. For fun, everyone. Killing innocent people, murdering vendors, murdering bus drivers, murdering people who were just trying to make a living, earn a living, and live a regular life. And they ruled the society with, it's an understatement to say an iron fist. Okay, Bashar al-Assad rules over Syria with an iron fist. These people were Satanists who were sadists, and they were ruling over the people with sadism. For example, if you were going to park your car in an area ran by a gang, the gang would come over and charge you $20. Now, $20 in El Salvador is a lot of money. I mean, $20 is a lot of money here in America. Imagine being charged $20 for every time you want to park your car. That's pretty draining. And if you could not pay the money, they would just steal your car. They would just say, okay, your car now belongs to us, and they would steal your car. It's not like in America, where you don't pay the you don't put the coins in a little machine for your parking space, and a police officer will come and put a ticket on your car. No, they would literally just steal your car. Your car is gone. It belongs to the gang. It belongs to MS-13. There was one story that I read where this girl's mother died, and so her and her sister sold their mom's house, and they sold the house for about $12,000, and then they split the money in half between themselves. MS-13 came along and said, "Hey, we heard that you made some money. You sold your house and you made some money, but you never came to us to give us our cut. So we're gonna take half the money." So instead of the girls making $12,000, they made $6,000 because half the money was stolen by some gangsters. They would force all of the bus department or the public transportation department to pay lots of money to them as a tax. And the tax was determined by how many buses were going through a particular route. So one bus route would be charged a certain amount of money based on how many buses go through that route. And if the transportation department failed to pay any one of these financial demands, they would just kill the bus employees. So if your bus route had 300 buses going through it, and MS-13 said, okay, we're going to charge you $3,000, and that wasn't paid, they would just murder the bus drivers. Simple as that. If you wanted to just leave your neighborhood to go to the grocery store or to go to any other sort of store, you had to go to the local gangster who was ruling over your neighborhood and ask for permission. It was worse than Sharia law. Worse than Sharia law. So the government of El Salvador has this president. The people elect this man, Nayib Bukele, as president. And he begins to go hard against the criminals beginning in 2019. Now, he had a secret meeting with the leaders of these various gangs, MS-13 and the like, and his government asked these gangster leaders what were their demands. And they said, well, and these leaders were in prison, and they're still in prison. Well, we want better conditions in the prison, better prison conditions. Got it. You got it. Oh, we want immunity from extradition. You got it. So the gangster leaders in prison, they started getting better treatment. And what that eventually did was cause enmity between the rank and file gangsters on the street and the gangster leaders who were in prison. And part of the deal was that the gangs would not fire back at the police when arrests were made. So they started arresting these criminals, and the gangster leaders said, okay, well, this is part of the deal. This is the game that the government is playing. They're just arresting criminals as a show. Don't retaliate. So after a while, the criminals went back and they started doing what they did. They started killing people, and they did a killing spree in 2020. The government went hard against the criminals as a response, and the gangs did not retaliate. They said, okay, this is part of the deal. This is part of the political scheme. The government wants to look tough against us. Don't retaliate. Okay. Let them arrest us. Okay. In 2021, the criminals did a killing spree. And as a response, the government did a crackdown on the criminals. No retaliation. 2022, the gangs did another killing spree. And this time, the Bukele regime, the Bukele government, said, okay, you guys want to go hard? You guys want to massacre civilians? Because that's what they were doing in these killing sprees. They were murdering vendors and just regular people. And so the Bukele government said, okay, if you want to play hard, we're going to play harder. And they got the whole military to crack down on the criminals. And nearly 70,000 people have been arrested. And a bunch of people have been shot and killed by the police and by the military. And the murder rate has gone down tremendously because of this. And now people are going to cafes, people are going to stores, people are playing soccer, and you have these soccer fields that were once just completely under the control of the gangs, and people couldn't play soccer. Teenagers weren't allowed to play soccer, and if they did try to play soccer, they would be shot at for merely trying to play soccer. And the government comes along and says, this is a huge problem. This needs to be fixed. And they did mass arrests. They killed a bunch of criminals. And who's mad? Who's mad? The New York Times is mad. Well, they were complaining about the high crime rates. They were saying, oh, look, El Salvador, it's this huge crime scene. It's the crime scene of the world. It has the highest murder rate in the world. And then when they actually purge the criminals, when they actually purge the streets and make the society actually livable, the government gets condemned. Why? People in the left love criminals. They sympathize with criminals, and they hate it when governments actually clean the streets of crime. They hate it. They love the Satanists, and they hate the righteous leaders when they actually cleanse the land of evil. That's the bottom line. I want to read to you guys some excerpts from a very informative article that was published by a newspaper called El Faro. And they did an in-depth article on the purge of the criminals in El Salvador and how it has immensely bettered the society. So I want to read to you guys some excerpts here. So here is an excerpt from the article. It talks about a guy named Marvin Reyes, who is a police officer. And it says here that Marvin Reyes is a police officer with 20 years experience who, as founding leader of the police workers movement, receives reports from hundreds of current and former unionized police officers across the country. Quote, the gangs, as we know them, as a national structure, no longer exist. What's left is a vestige. They have been left with diffuse control in a few places, barely a few tentacles attached to a few points. Here is another excerpt. Only gang members could enter this soccer field. So it's talking about this soccer field that was completely under the control of the Satanist criminals, and how now the teenagers can play soccer. They can play soccer without having to worry about being shot by these devil worshippers. Only gang members could enter this soccer field, said a resident of Las Margaritas, a neighborhood in Soyapango, pointing to kids locked in a heated soccer match on an afternoon in January. For years, Las Margaritas was a bastion of MS-13 and the field-bordered turf controlled by the 18th Street Sureños. Shootouts were common. The gang was like the police. They charged you $20 for every vehicle, and if you didn't pay, they'd steal it. If a relative wanted to visit, you had to ask for permission from the bichos, gang members. If you had a business, you had to pay them. Now none of them are left, he said. So imagine you can't play soccer because the gangsters will shoot at you. And then a leader like Bukele comes along, cleans the streets, arrests the criminals, does heavy policing, purges the crime out. And now it's safe to live. Now it's fun. Now it feels relaxed. You are in a more relaxed environment. But this is wrong, right? Mr. Bukele should have just given criminals some more money, should have been lenient on them. He's too tough on crime. That's a bad thing. Residents agree that the groups wielded cruel and unappealable power that demanded money for everyday affairs. A member of the communal board of Las Palmas said that after the death of her mother, she and her sister sold the old family home for $12,000 and split the proceeds. When the gang found out that they hadn't paid a tax, they stripped them of half of the money. I had to give them everything and didn't enjoy the inheritance from my mother, she said. Here you had to look, listen, and shut up, she added, recounting how neighbors listened to the torture of a young man who the gang had tried to coerce into revealing his father's location. So here is a quote from the president of the community board of Las Margaritas, and he says, quote, before we would have told you that we did not know anything. So in other words, people had to act stupid. They had to act that they didn't know that all these evils were going on because they were afraid of being killed by the gangsters. So before we would have told you that we didn't know anything, said the president of the board. The leaders even offered a tour of what they called the Forbidden City, a section where the gang had one of their destroyer homes to meet and torture their victims. On the couch in the deserted living room was a suitcase of abandoned clothing. And here you can see the torture chamber. It's now abandoned. Why? Because the criminals have been put in prison or driven out. Here's another excerpt from the article. Reparto Las Cañas is a colonia in Yopango that had been split in two. The upper section was controlled by MS-13 and the lower by 18th Street. The school, located in the upper area, had to close some of its classes due to student absences. The teachers rented a home in the lower section to give classes to the students who couldn't attend. On the last Sunday in January, the community organized a soccer match with players from both halves of the colonia. The players from the opposing teams had never met despite living dozens of yards apart. 5 years ago, we closed the soccer clinic because the bichos, the gangsters, would come onto the field to shoot at us. And the kids had learned to drop to the ground when they heard a gunshot, recounts former youth coach Francisco. So this was the life under the criminals, but according to the mainstream media, it's a bad thing what Bukele did in getting rid of these monsters. That's bad. He shouldn't have done that. He should just be, Bukele, according to these lunatics, should be like the people who rule Chicago or the people who rule Oakland or San Francisco. Being lenient to criminals increases the crime rate. But of course, you have the sophists who will come and gaslight you and say, no, according to this study, that's not true, blah, blah, blah. What really helps is, throwing money at the problem or something like that. And my mentality is what gets rid of crime is getting rid of criminals. It's really that simple. Everything feels so calm, said one woman, and she's describing how El Salvador is now under Bukele's policy. Everything feels so calm, said one woman, the owner of a small beachside restaurant. But we think that if they let those people out, then blood will be spilt here. She confirms that all of the gang members there were captured or fled, but she fears that the situation could be undone. And this is a concern that I have. Right now, the crime rate has dropped tremendously because of tough on crime policies. But we have to remember what happens if the government decides to rescind this policy. Now, that is where the problem is. The problem is not really the policy of doing mass arrest of criminals. The problem is the potential of the government rescinding such a policy and allowing the criminals to go back onto the streets and bringing back the horrific murder rate and crime rate. That is where the problem lies. And that's the concern that I have about this. And I've heard that a lot of these criminals in El Salvador have gone to Mexico. And they'll probably get into some kind of a war with the cartels there, competition between criminals, that sort of thing. But a lot of them have gone to Mexico because they know in Mexico they can do their crimes and get away with it. And that's the problem with Mexico. And that's what Mexico needs to do. Mexico needs to follow the example of Bukele and really implement a tough on crime policy. But Mexico isn't doing that because it's one of the most corrupt countries on the face of the earth. It says here in Nahuizalco, this is some Aztec word, Nahuizalco, in the western department of Sonsonate, the Central Park was a constant battlefield between three gangs. Sitting in the park, a man narrated how the funeral of a relative ended in tragedy. The cemetery sits in an area controlled by MS-13, but his home was controlled by a rival. During the burial, they were sprayed with bullets. His brother suffered a perforated lung, and a child lost an eye. He says that he has now seen tourists visit the park. So this park was a place where people were murdered, and because it was controlled by the gangs, and now tourists are visiting it. Who would have known that the solution to a high crime rate is simply getting rid of the criminals? In Santa Ana, the Emmanuel community near the city soccer stadium spent years under MS-13 control. For the mere reason of living there, 480 families couldn't visit nearby vicinities controlled by rival gangs. We're happy that now we can go anywhere, said Margarita. Vendors now more frequently visit. Now anybody can come, said Herminia, an elderly woman who lives in a shanty where she sells sugar, beans, coffee, and snacks. And this actually helps the locals. And you have people in the New York Times, saying, "Oh, look, Bukele has lowered the crime rate, but by what price?" Well, the price is freedom. The price is harmony. And when you give freedom to criminals, then regular people don't have freedom. You have freedom by getting rid of criminals. Once you have criminals thriving in your society, you have no freedom because now you are under the despotism of sadists and Satanists. In eastern San Miguel, on one end of Colonia La Prisita, once controlled by La Mirada, Locos, and MS-13, there's a strip of land along the edge of a basin of the Rio Grande that used to be a dump and gang meeting place. So it was a dump, and it was also a dump for the scum of humanity. Residents now clean the dump every Tuesday and Sunday and are planning to build a children's park in its place. Oh, how bad. How terrible. Building a children's park. That place should have been given to criminals because we all know that criminals are the result of poverty and those people should be treated with sympathy and compassion. How evil it is to build a children's park where that should be a safe space for criminals. The same relief can be felt in Panamericana, where MS-13 founded the Sailors Locos Salvatrucha, one of its strongest programs with presence in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. A bricklayer said he had to forfeit well-paying jobs located in rival territories. The biggest change now is that you can work anywhere. Oh, wow, economic freedom. Because you get rid of the criminals. El Faro also visited the colonias 10th of October, Santa Maria and El Cenizal in the municipality of San Marcos, 5 miles from San Salvador. You can enter the polygons, blocks of homes along a common passage, and nothing will happen to you because the chamocos, gang members who caused problems here, were taken away at the start of the state of exception. The state of exception, by the way, is the policy that is being implemented against the criminals. Says Antonio, nor is there any more gang presence in Santa Maria, a colonia of narrow, dusty passages. Now things are calm. Don't sweat, said a vendor. You have people in the Western media saying, well, there could be abuses done. There could be problems with this policy. Well, yeah, when you're implementing a policy on something as drastic as the high murder rate of El Salvador, yes, mistakes are going to be made. People are going to be beaten up. And this is always the risk that you face when implementing a policy or really implementing a solution on something as drastic as this. I mean, El Salvador had an extremely high murder rate. At one point, their murder rate was over 100 murders per every 100,000 people. Now, the American murder rate tends to be between 5 and 7 people, or really from 5 to 7 people per every 100,000 American citizens. This is, at one point in time, El Salvador had over 100 murders. Okay, so we're talking about the high murder rate here in the United States. So let's say, a high murder rate here would be 7 people per 100,000, 10 people per 100,000. El Salvador had at one point over 100 murders per every 100,000 people in the country. That is enormous. That's like South Africa tier level violence. So, of course, you're going to have some problems in the implementation of the solution against this horrendous evil, this cancer that took over the country. But what the evil people in the media do is they take a few little stories here and there and they make a mountain out of a molehill. So here's one of the stories of abuse. Here's one of the abuses that the media has talked about. So check this one out. A young man from Villa de Jesus, Soyapango, recounted, "I was coming home from work and a soldier told me, 'Stop right there, you son of a bitch.' He gave me a good kicking and left." So I can handle this as opposed to MS-13 Satanists ruling over your neighborhood and murdering innocent people for fun. Okay? If this is one of the risks that we have to face to get rid of this horrific crime rate and to get rid of the Satanists, I'll accept it gladly. Thank you very much. I'll take some police officers beating up some punk teenagers once in a while over Satanists ruling over my neighborhood any day. So it says here, since 2015, the San Salvador mayor's office has registered some 40,000 formal and informal vendors in the Central District. Some 1.2 million people transit those 250 blocks every day from 5:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. Vendors long tiptoed through slices of the area governed by different gangs. Turf borders were drawn by single streets. Food vendors couldn't sell a meal 10 yards from where they prepared it. So you can't sell food 10 yards away because that area is ruled by some devil-worshipping metalheads. But we want to complain about some cop who gave a kicking to a teenager, probably because that teenager was dressed up like a cholo. Like, you want to dress up like a cholo, you dumb bastard. Here, let me give you a good kick in the ass. Get out of here. Give me a break. And that's what the media does. They find these little stories like, oh, this one guy got arrested. This one guy was arrested, but he really didn't do anything. Or, the family claims that he was innocent. And so, oh, look, this is horrific. We have to just, I guess, allow criminals to run the streets because we can't do mass arrests. If we do, then we're going to look like tyrants, or some mistakes may be made, and we don't want that. We can't have that, even though when we build the highway, we can actually calculate how many people will die from car accidents on that highway every single year, and yet we still build that highway because we will put the convenience of a highway over the potential risks that are involved in erecting a highway. So the same thing, the same logic applies to fighting crime. We know for a fact that there will be some problems in fighting crime, but in order to establish a harmonious society, we will implement tough on crime policies. You have cops who will make mistakes. You have cops who will break into a house looking for a criminal and they have the wrong address and they beat up some guy who's completely innocent. These things are going to happen. But it's either allowing some risks, accepting some risks, or having an immense murder rate that devastates your society. So here's a vendor who gives his testimony as to how low the crime rate is now thanks to Bukele's policies. I had not walked down 3rd Street East in years. She, meaning the guy's wife, still scolds me when she finds out that I passed through there, says a vendor in the Teneti market deep in downtown San Salvador, pointing to his wife. That was the zone of the Centrales Locos who come from San Judas and Valle Verde. They would kill me if they saw me walk by. Just by walking by, they killed this guy. It's not like they were just fighting other criminals. Like traditionally, mobsters just will fight other criminals. No, these guys kill innocent people for fun. 5 blocks north, at the border between MS-13 and the Revolucionarios, near the National Theater, another vendor agreed to speak. The only one left selling is the woman of one of the leaders. Other than her, not even relatives, he claimed. They, the police and soldiers, come with lists in hand to grab people. We all know who they are. So here we know the cops have purged out a lot. Really, they've purged out most of the criminals who were devastating the country. In October, this is a testimony from another citizen of El Salvador. In October, I paid rent, extortion. But at the beginning of November, detectives came here to interview business managers and owners. After the detectives' visit, the muchachos, gang members, didn't come around anymore, and they haven't even called me to demand their quota, said the owner of a restaurant in San Salvador, who had paid $275 every month. That's huge money in that country, by the way. $275 every month since 2015 in one of the busiest areas of the capital controlled by the Revolucionarios. Juan Pablo Alvarez, union director of Salvadoran Routes United, which represents 5,000 public transportation units, dimensioned the extortion phenomenon. Bus Route 29 paid $12,000 monthly for 100 buses. Route 41A paid $3,000 monthly, but they only had 30 buses. Now, I would say that extortion has been reduced by 95%. In the metropolitan area, they've been hit the hardest. Today, if I have problems in Las Margaritas, I file a report and the government goes and shakes them up. The gangs no longer even dare to call you. So people are terrified of gangsters and they go, oh yes, they're so evil, they're so this. But when you have a tough on crime policy and you allow police officers to police and you allow soldiers to police and you clean out the streets and you purge out the streets of these scumbags, they are terrified because at the end of the day, they're like coyotes. They're only strong in numbers. They're only strong when they are facing a vulnerable, terrified, and weak society. But when they are faced with people who are armed with guns, who are trained, police officers and soldiers, they are scared. They're terrified when a tough on crime policy is imposed upon them. And that's what needs to be done in America. Every day I hear about robberies and murders happening in Chicago, Oakland, San Francisco, Houston, Detroit. They're happening all throughout the country. Florida, Los Angeles. But the problem is America has a lenient policy. It's too lenient. And all the criminals in America know the law. They know the law better than the average person. And they know the loopholes. They know, well, if I do this one crime, I can get out after this many months. I can get out after a year. I'll be back in the street in a week, blah, 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 blah. They all know the loopholes because they all have lawyers or they've had lawyers who educated them on this stuff. And that is the problem. What needs to be done is a very, very harsh policy, a ruthless policy on crime. And that way, not only do you clean the streets of the criminals, but you also will force people to think twice before committing a crime because they would be so terrified of the strong hand of the state. And that's exactly what needs to be done. And for decades, El Salvador had a very horrific crime problem, and it took a Palestinian guy to fix it up. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.